Hi guys, welcome back. Today we are going to continue our discussion about British literature. More specifically, we're going to talk about Into the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. You should be on part 1 already, through with that. Part 1 is called The Window. One of the cool parts about part 1 is that Virginia Woolf wrote a good chunk of this book, and this all takes place in the afternoon. She uses stream of consciousness. That's how we see the thoughts of so many of the characters. We find out more about the characters through what they're thinking. And that takes up, in one afternoon, she wrote a lot. Because we're constantly shifting. We're shifting from what Lily's thinking about to what Charles Tansley is talking about. Different things like that, okay? So that's something to keep in mind. Before, it wasn't really like that. We saw how people felt through their interactions, which, we're not even 100% sure if that's how they felt. Victorian era, they had to act proper. They couldn't act mad if someone made them upset, things like that. So in the first half of the book, we have met the Ramsay family. The Ramsay family is at their summer home, so that kind of suggests maybe they're well off. They have enough money to afford seasonal homes. We meet Mr. Ramsay, who is the father figure. He's an intellect, he's a philosopher. He's not very friendly, as we see when he talks to James. He's very blunt, straightforward, complete opposite of Mrs. Ramsay, who's his wife, the mother. She is very friendly. She is a nurturer. You see how she's very optimistic when she talks to James. So Mrs. Ramsay is actually the glue of the household. Everyone knows each other through Mrs. Ramsay. The way I like to think of it when I read this book, I think of it kind of like a wheel. So here's the middle of, let's say, a bicycle wheel. So we have Mrs. Ramsay. We'll put MR, Mrs. Ramsay, okay? All right, and everyone knows each other through her. So we have Mr. Ramsay, we have Lily, we have Minta Doyle, we have Paul, we have Charles, we have William Banks, all right, and then we have the children, okay? They all know each other because of Mrs. Ramsay. Okay, she's the glue. She holds the family together. She holds the friends together as well. Something important to know is that Minta Doyle and Paul, they're engaged, as we saw in the first part. That wouldn't have happened if Mrs. Ramsay hadn't pushed it. So she's very old-fashioned. She wants to set people up because that's what was expected. You're expected to get married by a certain time. Okay, so we see the dinner scene occurring towards the end of part 1. That's a very, very important scene. We see conversation, we see the dialogue, but we also see how people react to the conversations. So we see how Lily reacts when Charles Tansley says women can't be painters or writers. We see that she's mad and she's confused. She's wondering why she's so different. Why does she think she can't get married? When she finds out about Paul and Minta being engaged, she thinks it is the silliest thing. She thinks, poor Minta, how could she do this with her life? Now she'll be forever stuck with a man doing what the man wants to do. So Lily was very independent, okay? So I want us to think about Mrs. Ramsay being the old-fashioned. She's the Victorian era, and I want us to think about Lily being the modern era. She loves to paint. She doesn't want to get married. She's not very motherly. She doesn't want to be a housewife, okay? So we're going to compare those two. Lily Brosco, which I've mentioned, she respects Mrs. Ramsay, but they're quite opposite, like I mentioned before. Mrs. Ramsay represents how the roles of women used to be. They used to be at home. They used to be the hostess to parties. They are the glue to the family. They hold the family apart, together rather. Lily represents how women are becoming artists and writers. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and I want you to look at page 103, okay? It says, this is the end of the dinner party, okay? Mrs. Ramsay is so proud of what she has accomplished in this dinner party. It reads, when her foot on the threshold, she waited a moment longer in the scene, which is vanishing even as she looked, okay? She was looking at what just happened. She was very, very in touch with moments. She knew a moment would pass in no time, and she had to hold on to that moment. It was one of her most cherished things, these moments. As she moved and took Minta's arm and left the room, it changed. She knew things were going to change after that, kind of like a foreshadowing. Something big was about to happen. It shaped itself differently. It had become, she knew, giving one last look over her shoulder already in the past. Okay? So what could we suggest that will happen to Mrs. Ramsay? As you can see at the end of it, Miss Ramsay actually dies. The family is no longer the same, so let's go ahead, get our chart. Imagine if she was gone. These people are no longer connected, okay? Okay, so we see as we go through the second part, the family gets back together. They go to the lighthouse, but it takes 10 years, okay? So without Mrs. Ramsay, the kids, Mr. Ramsay, Lily, Charles, they don't see each other for 10 years, okay? So think of that as Mrs. Ramsay being the Victorian era, okay? It's gone now. It is described, the house is described dead, unlively. Miss Ramsay is dead. So is the Victorian era. Things are new now. Lily is a bigger character now because Mrs. Ramsay's gone. She describes Mrs. Ramsay as this right here. Let me find it. It says, Mrs. Ramsay, this is on page 162, by the way. Mrs. Ramsay has faded and gone, she thought. We can override her wishes, improve away her limited, old-fashioned ideas. She recedes further and further from us, okay? And we no longer have to hear her saying, Mary, Mary, okay? Because she was very, very for Lily getting married, okay? So she'd always tell her to marry, and Lily didn't like that. It goes on to say, it has all gone against her wishes. They're happy like that, though. I'm happy like this. Life has changed completely. All that her being, even her beauty, became for a moment dusty and out of date. Okay, so this very much describes Victorian. Yes, it's beautiful, beautiful era, but it was out of date. It no longer worked for the new world. Okay? So let's talk about Lily. Lily was saying how, let me just read it because it would be better described. Beauty had a penalty. It came too readily, came too completely. It stilled life, froze it. One forgot its little agitations. The flush, the pallor, some queer distortion, some light or shadow which made the face unrecognizable for a moment. She's talking about Mrs. Ramsay. As we remember, she's trying to paint Mrs. Ramsay. And you see how she describes the painting. It's very abstract. That's very much how modern was. She painted Mrs. Ramsay not as the beautiful prim and proper, but a new kind of Mrs. Ramsay, how she wanted to portray her now that she was gone. She wanted her to be a modern woman made out of triangles, geometrical shapes, very modern. Okay, so that was Lily kind of saying this is the world now and we're very happy with it. Okay, so go ahead. I want you in your discussion postings, describe the first part of the novel. Let's say that is how the world was in the Victorian era or even before the war. Okay, all of a sudden when Mrs. Ramsay dies, when the Victorian era dies, when the war is over, we shift over to the modern era, okay? The modern era, art is being done in new ways, literature is being done in new ways. We see a lot of new things, okay? I want us to compare the eras with the characters in the story. All right? Look forward to hearing from you.